Thank you, David. And first, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I really appreciate your coming. Just a couple quick ground rules before I do a little introduction. And that is, one, if you have cell phones, if you could please turn them off. I left mine in the car so I wouldn't get in trouble. One must lead by example. And secondly, if you have any questions, which I welcome, or any comments, could you please just keep them until the end of the session, and then I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to have some discussion as well. Now, as David alluded to, I do go way back in a Skowhegan connection. In a way, it actually begins about 100 years ago, and I'm not 50, but I'm not 100 either, somewhere in between. But in the fall of 1923, my mother, Esther Knudsen, later Shettleworth, started her career as a freshman at Colby College, the old Colby on the Kennebec, right near the village of Waterville, well, within Waterville, but just above the town. And it was at that point that she made some lifelong friendships with other women. And several of those women were related to Skowhegan, either as summer visitors or as residents. And they included Grace Heffron Smith, whose husband, Harry Smith, was an insurance man here. And they lived literally diagonally across the street in a little house. Tell more about that in a moment. Ruby Dyer, who some of you may remember was the longtime columnist of Around Skowhegan. Ruby would call you up and ask you what was going on in your life, and the next week it would appear in the Somerset Reporter. And then there was Marjorie Pierce, who had a summer cottage, and also Grace Fox Herrick, whose family was from here, but who taught in Northeast Harbor. And so it was these wonderful ladies who would get together every summer at their cottages, and they lured my mother and the rest of my family, my father and my sister and myself, to rent a cottage from Paul and Dorothea Stewart in the summer of 1955. And that led to actually spending 15 summers on Lake Wessarunset on the East Madison side. And it was really just the most wonderful and formative experience, because it was at that point in 1955 that I first began to discover collecting antiques and historical materials. Stopped at a wonderful shop in Bingham on the way back from a trip to Quebec, Alkin's Antiques, when I was 6 going on 7. And then we would use wonderful Central Maine as a place to look for antiques and historical material those 15 summers. Many happy memories of going to Lakewood Theater. We had season tickets, and the wonderful memories of some of the greatest stars of the mid-20th century, including Gloria Swanson and the Gish sisters, and just so on, remarkable people who did summer stock there. So I got to know Skowhegan very well. And most importantly, I think, was the History House and the library, because those were both wonderful resources for someone who was beginning to understand that they were interested in history. And I won't go too much longer on this because I want to show you the slides, but I want to recount one particular memory about the library. The first season, when I was 6 going on 7, I was sent up those curving stairs in the tower to the children's room on the 2nd floor. And that was okay, but I was became quickly bored by that. And so the second season, 7 going on 8, my mother spoke to Mary Marston, the wonderful librarian, and said, would it be all right if Earle used the adult history section? And she said, well, of course, So I remember, taking out wonderful books, things like McKinley, Cantor's In the Days of McKinley, and the library had the full 10-volume set of Miller's Illustrated History of the Civil War that was published in 1911 for the 50th anniversary of the Civil War. And I took those out one at a time and just pawed through them and learned from them. And so the Skowhegan Library was just a great cultural experience for me as a youngster, and I still remember it to this day. Tonight, we're going to focus on architecture. And forgive me if I use a few formal terms, but hopefully it will be a learning experience for us all. But Skowhegan has had and continues to have a very rich architectural heritage. We ask ourselves why. And I think, part of it is the fact that, you're now celebrating your 200th anniversary as a town this year. And the fact is that by the mid-19th century, Skowhegan was a very thriving community, based on several industries, particularly the logging industry, in which, of course, some individuals made fabulous fortunes, including the Coleman family. But in addition to that, there were the textile mills, later on the shoe factories, and a number of other smaller industries. And then, of course, we had Abner Coleman about 1870 saying, if you move the county seat from Norwich Walk to Skowhegan, I'll build you a courthouse. And so the offer was taken, and Norwich Walk was kind of left behind, and Skowhegan thrived even more. So that by the time I got here in the mid-50s, it was still a very thriving place. The textile mills were still in place, but sadly about to disappear. And in fact, that was one of the dramatic things of my youth was Paul Stewart, whom we rented from, was a lifelong, really very talented textile designer. And he lost his position here in Skowhegan and was very fortunate to be able to have to go to Massachusetts to the J.P. Stevens Company and continue his work there. So we're looking at Skowhegan as it was in the 50s and 60s. And we will start with the Governor Abner Coleman house, built with his brother, Philander Coleman, in 1849. It, of course, was one of the great landmarks of the community. This particular photograph is really one of the few sort of semi-modern photographs that I'll show you tonight. It was taken by myself in the fall of 1973 when I began working for the state. And of course, I won't go into any great detail, but I think we all know that quite a bit has changed in the last 50 years in regard to this great house, and it's very telling. But here it is in its glory, and it really represents really the triumph and the success of both Abner Coleman and his brother Philander, primarily in the lumber business, but then in their ability to use their lumber money to diverse uses, railroads, real estate, so on. And also in particular for Abner, who was governor in the midst of the Civil War, to also be an extraordinarily generous donor toward education in Maine, to Colby, to the University of Maine, to Coleman Institute, and so on. He certainly left a legacy, including money to build the library after his death. This is one of the great examples of what we call the Greek revival in Maine architecture. It's in the Greek temple style, full-blown with this series of columns across the front. And we know that the architect builder was one Joseph Bigelow of Skowhegan, who we'll be hearing more about because he was the major architect builder of Skowhegan in the mid-19th century. We're going to just dwell briefly on domestic architecture to start out with. This is another major example of its period. This is the General Russell Shepherd House on Water Street of 1873, still standing. This is an old photograph, about 1940. In fact, most of these from now on, except for at the end, will be old postcard views. Old postcards are a wonderful record. So we're looking here at what we would call a French Second Empire or Mansard style house with a very distinctive roof on the third floor with the projecting dormers. 1873, just right for this house. This style was very popular in Maine in the 1860s and 70s during and after the Civil War. And being here at the Margaret Chase Smith Library, I should add that this was later owned by Clyde Smith and Margaret Chase Smith in the mid-20th century. Here is another of Skowhegan's great examples of a domestic architecture, still very much with us and beautifully preserved. We'll see some contemporary photographs of it a little bit later. This is the Samuel W. Gould house on Elm Street of 1887. And we see in this postcard view that Mr. Gould is up on the upper left. He was at that point a congressman, so who knows, he might have used some of these postcards for campaigning, I don't know. But he certainly got his picture on the postcard. It's what we call the Queen Anne style, a style which in terms of that term actually kind of defies definition. It's sort of English in style. You can see the sort of half-timbered gable at the front, but it's a wonderful, fanciful style with the wraparound porch, the corner tower, almost feels like a bit of a lighthouse tower at the corner, and gables and different materials used for the surface, and then wonderful paint colors. It's really a great house. 1887, and the architect is John W. Russell of Boston, who had Skowhegan connections. And now we're here at the Margaret Chase Smith Library, and I show you Margaret Chase Smith's house as it was originally built, a kind of a combination of a post-World War II mid-modern ranch-style house, but with sort of traditional, almost Cape Cod colonial revival feeling to it. Senator Smith built this house in 1949, and she expanded it in 1952 with a carport to the right, and then additional rooms in 1955. And the rooms in 55 went on because she was that year, that summer, which was the summer I arrived in Skowhegan, entertaining President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And I have these wonderful memories because my mother's friend, Grace Smith, lived diagonally across. We got a pass to go up to her house. We had binoculars, and I mean, the security would never allow this today, but we were standing on the roadside watching the President of the United States, the Governor, Edmund Muskie, and Senator Smith eating lobsters. So, a great memory. The architect is Alonzo Harriman of Auburn, who apparently was a favorite of Margaret Chase Smith. She used him also for her summer home down in Harpswell, and he was a major mid-20th century architect based in Lewiston and Auburn. Now we turn to churches, and there was and still are an abundance of wonderful church architecture in Skowhegan. The Congregational Church is on Island Avenue, built in 1862 in what we would call the Italianate style, because primarily the motif here is arches, the arched window over the big doorway, the arched windows on the body of the church, the arches in the tower. The architect is Thomas Holt, who was based in Bethel and then in Yarmouth. He was also involved with the railroads, and I think it was a sort of a combination of he was going back and forth all through these Maine communities, working for the Maine Central Railroad, but also taking architectural commissions at the same time. I don't know if he had a railroad car, if he had a rolling architectural office, but in any case, here he is in Skowhegan in 1862. And then across the street, no longer standing, the Methodist Church on Island Avenue of 1866-67. Again, very strong in this Italianate motif with the arched doorways, windows, arches in the tower. Very impressive wooden building. 1866-67, designed by Charles F. Douglas. Was a very interesting architect. He was born up in the Dexter, Dover, Foxcroft area. He came down to Norwich Walk in the 1850s and worked extensively in Skowhegan and Norwich Walk in the 1850s and 60s. His own house is that great yellow Italianate villa house in Norwich Walk, still standing. And then he went briefly to Lewiston and then on to Philadelphia. The Notre Dame de Lourdes Church on Water Street was built in 1881 and then replaced in the mid-20th century by the current Catholic Church. Here we see again this arched motif used throughout the building. And then a sad loss in recent years, the Bethany Baptist Church on Madison Avenue of 1889. This was the largest and the most elaborate of the shingle style, late 19th century shingle style churches designed by the leading architect in Maine of his time, John Calvin Stevens. He did a whole series of these Baptist churches. He got connected with the Baptist Conference in Maine, and during the 1880s, 90s, and early 1900s, he did these shingle-style churches for the Baptists all over Maine. But this was by far the largest and the most elaborate. And there's a simplicity to the shingle style, the use of very simple forms, for example, the great triangular roof form over the arched entrance, the side gables just simply pointed, the great bell tower. And this also had a very elaborate interior with large sheets of stained glass. I remember going to services and weddings here. We were not Baptist, but I did like the architecture very much. Then we move on to another major landmark by John Calvin Stevens, happily still standing and I think very well cared for by the town, the municipal building. At this site in 1905, the Hotel Heseltine burned, and we'll see that in a few minutes. But it was replaced in 1907 to 1909 by this very handsome sort of Georgian revival, Beaux-Arts municipal building. And of course, town halls and municipal buildings are really emblematic of what towns think of themselves. And certainly, Skowhegan had a very good opinion of itself in 1907 in hiring the state's leading architect and creating this really very handsome public building. John Calvin Stevens was joined by his son, John Howard Stevens, in doing the designs for this building. And it's very interesting because it's just at this very moment that they are also working on the Portland City Hall. And here's the interior of the auditorium, opera house. And this was very typical of municipal buildings of the period to include a large public performance space that could also be used for town meetings as well and other purposes. But here is this wonderful opera house stage with these ladies to the left and right holding the curtain shortly after its opening in 1909. Now we're now shifting to schools, and we're going to look at the Park School over by the old shoe factory. And I'm very happy to say, in my recent visit to Skowhegan, David will attest to the fact that I picked the literally hottest day of the year so far to come with my photographer. We're going to do a few current views at the end of the talk, and we, of course, photographed this building. It's really a lovely example of a school building of the 1880s when what we call the Richardson Romanesque or the Romanesque revival was very much in fashion, and that's characterized particularly by the lovely arched doorway, a wonderful inviting doorway, the decorative brickwork, and the use of terracotta for the name of the school, and also the little terracotta ornament in the gable. This was designed by a very prominent Portland architect and his partner, Francis Fassett and Frederick Thompson. And I'm very happy to say that this building has found a new life with New Balance as their outlet store. And I think they're doing a nice job with it. And the important thing with old buildings that no longer serve their original purpose is to find a new purpose and a new life. And certainly, I'm happy to say this is the case. Looking at other schools, however, that are no longer with us, we're on Levitt Street, and this is the Garfield and Lincoln schools. To the left is the earlier school that was originally known as the Levitt Street School, built in 1869, very simple wooden Italianate schoolhouse. And then, of course, when President Garfield was assassinated in 1881, many things were named for him. In fact, there was a big almost funeral-like observance in the Coburn Hall at the time of his death. And so they named the school on the left for him. And then, of course, when they built the second school next door in 1895, they named it after the other martyred president, Abraham Lincoln. And here is that school, the Lincoln School, very handsome example of a late 19th century school in what we would probably call the colonial revival style, with its big hip roof, its dormer. The work of Elmer I. Thomas, a Lewiston architect, a very talented architect who sadly died very young. He came back from his training in 1890 to Lewiston and died in 1896. He was only in his early 30s, so Skowhegan received one of the last of his buildings. And then the parochial school at the right, which was built in 1898 and still standing on Water Street. And to the left was originally a private residence that became the parochial residence. This building looks back in time, even though it's 1898, to the mansard roof style of maybe a generation before. And speaking of the mansard roof style for buildings, here we're looking at the old high school on Island Avenue, built in 1870-71. It was designed by Fassett of Portland, Francis Fassett. And interestingly, he developed this particular plan that you see here with the side entrance to the left, and actually used it in Gardner and other communities at the same time in the early to mid 1870s. And this building, of course, is now gone. And it was the new high school, still standing, built in 1928-29, is a very handsome example of the high school and junior high school architecture of the early 20th century. It's what we would call colonial revival or Georgian revival, with its very elegant classical proportions, its semicircular portico, its pilasters on either side at the entrance bay. The work of Harry S. Coombs from Lewiston. And now we come to our beloved library, the Skowhegan Free Library on Elm Street of 1889, built at least in part with a bequest from Abner Coleman, who had died in 1885. It's in what we would call a kind of combination of Queen Anne and Romanesque revival, particularly the wonderful inviting arched door that we also saw to some degree on the Stevens Church and on the Fassett School is particularly prominent here, and the wonderful octagonal tower at the right, and then this great display of terracotta ornament in the arch above the second floor window with the emblems of the different Civil War corps. And of course, part of the whole issue of building this building was Skowhegan opted, instead of having a sort of an outdoor sculptural memorial to the Civil War, those who served and those who lost their lives, Skowhegan did a rather novel thing in creating an indoor memorial in which the plaque of those who served is in the reading room to the left, the front here, a plaque listing the names of those who served, and then a series of beautiful stained glass windows that are memorial windows. And of course, the whole interior of this building is very richly appointed with beautiful golden oak woodwork and lovely terracotta fireplaces. The architect was Edwin E. Lewis of Gardner, who was a very fine architect in the Kennebec Valley in the 1880s and 90s. And now we have the Firehouse on Island Avenue, which is still in use today, 1904. Again, we see this arched motif, which we would term Romanesque or Romanesque revival. The double windows then brought together above with the overarching arch, and three bays for the fire equipment. William R. Miller of Lewiston was the architect. And here's a view of how the building actually functioned and still functions today, with period fire equipment from the early 20th century about ready to go out. And at this point, when this view was taken, the fire department was not yet mechanized. As you can see, the horses are there. We might take this building for granted. It's right across from the municipal building, but it is the U.S. Post Office of 1916 to 18, designed by the then head of the Government Architectural Office, James A. Whitmore. And it's really a very simple, very unassuming building, but I think beautifully proportioned and very restrained, and also takes advantage of its location as it turns the corner from Water Street to North Street. And then not too far from there is that Somerset County Courthouse that Abner Coleman said he would build if people would move the county seat to Norridgewock. And there's a wonderful period cartoon that exists in a small photograph showing a courthouse being, in the winter, being lifted onto a big sled and being drawn by horses from Norridgewock to Skowhegan. Now, it didn't quite happen that way. He put the money up and built this very substantial building. And here we see it actually in an early 20th century post view before any of the additions. Stevens did some work on this building around 1905, and then there were additions to it. But it still has its overall original form today. It's a very impressive Italianate building, great public building with these wonderful arched windows, mostly brickwork, with very elaborate brickwork, but with also accents of granite. And the architect here is, again, Charles F. Douglas, who had also done the Methodist Church on Island Avenue. The building was completed in 1873. And of course, if you have a courthouse, you have to have a jail and a jailer's house. And so very nearby, this is the jailer's house, very nice little Greek Revival house of probably mid-19th century. And then in 1895, George M. Coombs from Lewiston was asked to design a new jail this was at Court and High Streets. And again, it's in this sort of Romanesque style with the arched windows. And then he was called back a few years later to expand the jail because in 1909, the county decided to add a workshop for the inmates. And this is, of course, the building that's still with us today and is now a brewery. So, creative reuse. I'm sure the inmates would have appreciated that. Here, one of the great lost buildings of the town. And of course, this is the case in so many communities across Maine, because when the Maine Central Railroad decided no longer to have passenger service in 1960, it vacated so many of its great stations. Some of them have been reused, but many of them were torn down. Here, we're looking at the Maine Central Railroad station of 1888 on Russell Street. The building of a new appropriate station in Skowhegan was, according to Louise Helen Coben's history and also newspaper articles that I've read, was a long time bone of contention between the railroad and the townspeople. They kept begging for a proper station. Apparently the station had originally come in the mid-19th century and was very inadequate. And finally, the railroad gave them this very elaborate Queen Anne style station with a tower, with a clock tower. It's interesting that this is the same year that the Maine Central built the great Union Station in Portland with of course, all of granite, but with a similar grand clock tower statement. So I guess that, the directors of the railroad finally heard the word from Skowhegan. And there's the other side of the building. It's really quite a grand building. And then to the right, we have appropriately the Maine Central Hotel, originally called that. It was an L of the Heseltine Hotel that was moved adjacent to the station in 1904. So this postcard is just a little after 1904. And then it morphed into, here's another old view of it. As I say, it was a wing. It was just a section of the Heseltine Hotel. And of course, if it hadn't been moved in 1904, it would have burned the next year. So it was an advantageous move. This I remember generally in this form, but around 1930, it was remodeled into the Milburn Hotel. And then it was acquired about that time by the Skowhegan house that we'll get into in a moment nearby. But this is the building I remember. And of course, this was also at that point in time after the railroad station disappeared, was where I think it was the A&P was built. That's right, yes. Okay, so now we move on to hotels, as we've already seen. This was probably, for a while at least, the Grand Hotel of Skowhegan. This was the Heseltine House on Water Street that was built in 1881, and it was on the site of the municipal building. It burned in 1905 and was replaced by the municipal building. It's a combination of that mansard roof style for the central pavilion, with the curved or slanted roof line with the projecting dormers, but then the bracketed cornice belays the Italianate style as well. However, Skowhegan must have been thriving in the early 1880s because not only did they build the Heseltine House in 1881, but the following year, they built an equally large hotel at the corner of Madison Avenue and Elm Streets called the Hotel Coleman. And this was while Abner Coleman was still living, so it was in his honor. And it really was a very impressive building architecturally. It's what we would call a combination, again, of shingle style and Queen Anne with the great porches, the corner tower, the projecting dormers, and interestingly, designed by John Calvin Stevens as a young architect working with Francis Fassett in Portland, built in 1882 and then tragically burned in 1918. Down the street, a little less grand, but with a very interesting history, the Skowhegan House on Russell Street. This opened originally in the mid-19th century as the Lyford Tavern, and then became the Elm House, and it was purchased by Warren and Charles Tuttle in 1901, who raised the main building at Elm to add 20 rooms, corner towers, and piazzas. Snow and Humphrey, who were local Skowhegan and Madison architects, designed this Queen Anne style expansion. And then there were further additions made to the building in the 1920s when it was renamed not just the Skowhegan House, but the new Skowhegan House from 1923. And by 1928, with the Heseltine House gone and the Coleman House gone, the new Skowhegan House was, according to the Coleman history, considered the town's leading hotel. And you note too that they are by this time servicing automobile trade. There's the town, the sign garage on the left there. Now, I won't dwell for long in this lecture on Water Street. I'm only showing you a couple images, but it's not for want of appreciating the rich architectural heritage that is there, both in the old photographs, because this has always been Skowhegan's active commercial center, Water Street, right by the river, but also because today, in 2023, well, some areas of Skowhegan have changed dramatically, like Madison Avenue. On the other hand, there's still a rich period feeling of the early 20th century, of Main Street, Maine, Main Street, America, in this Water Street of Skowhegan. This is a view from the 1920s. And here's a view from the 1960s. And I won't try, this really Water Street merits a separate discussion, a separate lecture, going building by building. But there's really a treasure house of late 19th, early 20th century commercial architecture along Water Street to this day. I will just point out a couple things. One, of course, is the First National Bank, beautiful classical Beaux-Arts building with granite facade, designed in 1910 by Penn Varney, who was a Boston architect, and not only the exterior, but the elaborate interior as well. Yes, what's playing? Spencer Tracy's Dante's Inferno. Oh, goodness. Well, I guess, you know, back in 1940 or so, you could have Dante's Inferno, and I suppose it's not much different from Oppenheimer today. But anyway, I grew up in a household where it was a reading household. And we did get a television in 1952, but that was only to watch the fall election of 1952. And then it was very carefully rationed for my older sister and myself. And we very rarely went to movies until we came to Skowhegan. And then there were those rainy afternoons, and my mother figured it was probably just as well to take us to the movies. And so I love this theater. It's the Strand Theater on Court Street, built in 1929, very stylish building in the colonial revival style. And so, you know, you can say what you want, but Skowhegan has its great classic movie house here. And the architects were Desmond and Lord of Boston, who were very prominent first half of the 20th century New England architects. Now we turn to the factories. And this factory, which happily is still very much a part of the scene and the life of Skowhegan, remarkable, is originally built in 1882 as the Keane Brothers shoe factory. It's a very interesting story behind it. Some of you will know, but basically it was a local effort in which, of course, Abner Coleman was the chief backer, but many others subscribed and bought shares of stock and amassed a sufficient amount of money to entice the Keane brothers from New Hampshire to come over and establish a shoe factory. And then not only did the community hire an architect to design their shoe factory, a man named Sawyer of Boston, but they also created a large park in front of the shoe factory and hired Joseph Curtis, who was a major Boston landscape architect, to create the park, thus the Park School. And on early maps, you see this large park. And there also, the company built workers' housing as well. So it was really a very enlightened and well thought out development. And I'm happy to say that New Balance now has it. They're going to be expanding it, but I think expanding it quite sympathetically, architecturally. And it's a real landmark when so many of the mills and shoe factories in Maine have either disappeared or had to be converted into new uses. It's great to see this building still thriving. Speaking of buildings that have been lost in this regard, for a moment, I'm losing my notes here. Here we are. This is the Coburn Woolen Mill at Mill and Main Streets of 1875, a large, simple brick structure for woolen textile manufacturing. And it became part of a large chain of New England mills in 1899 under the aegis of the American Woolen Mill Company. And then later was the Anderson Mill, of course, no longer standing. And here's another view of it. This was a massive structure as you cross the bridge. I just have the faintest memories of it before it was torn down. And this was, again, ultimately part of the American Woolen Mill chain. It started out as the Marston Woolen Mill Company. And of course, the Marstons were part of the Coburn family. West Front Street, 1903. Mill was founded in 1892 and then taken over by American Woolen in 1913. And there's another view of this building now under the aegis of the American Woolen. And in the background, you can see the back of the shoe factory. And this building is undergoing a renaissance as well, which is very exciting. This is the Maine Spinning Company Mill on Island Avenue, built in 1922. It's a classic example of early 20th century industrial design. By the early 20th century, it was quite normal to build large factories, mills, industrial buildings with using steel frame construction, using fireproof materials like concrete, and creating these large glass windows that allowed more light into the building, maybe a little better working conditions, and these repetitive, almost modern designs for the elevations of the building. The prime engineer architect of New England mill buildings from the mid-19th century well into the 20th century was a company in Boston called Lockwood Green and Company, and they're the designers of this building. Now, in 1904, a beautiful bridge was built in modern style. The early bridges, of course, along the channels of the Kennebec River were simple wooden bridges and then coven bridges. And then in 1904, the American Bridge Company was hired for $34,000 to build this magnificent steel bridge. This is a side view of it, and on the left, we get to see part of the Coleman Mill complex. And then there's the experience of crossing over this bridge in the early 20th century. Of course, it's been replaced in recent times, but these steel bridges of the early 20th century were really remarkable feats of engineering, and they also were rather powerful sculptural statements as well. And then we have the Weston Station of the Central Maine Power Company, both the station and the dams, built in 1919 and 20. The construction photographs of this project show it to be a really immense and challenging project to actually create these dams and to create a powerhouse along the Kennebec. The engineer was a man named F.A. Mason, but John Calvin Stevens and his son returned again to Skowhegan in 1919 to design the exterior shell of the Weston Station. And that's why this is such a handsome building. And this was very much a part of the concept that Walter Wyman and Harvey Doane Eaton had in their vision for the Central Maine Power Company when they were amalgamating dozens of small local power companies into the Central Maine Power. And they wanted to create really a corporate image that they were up to date, that they cared about design, that the design was an important part of their selling of their new company. And so they hired Stevens to do a whole series of these beautiful 19-teens and 20s power stations along the rivers. Now we turn to Elm Street, and we're looking into the town, sort of center right. You can just see a little bit of the old Coleman House Hotel. When I was here in Skowhegan in the 50s and 60s, this still had that look, that great trees were still here. Most of the old houses were here. Some changes have occurred, but Elm Street is still one of the historic streets of the community. And then, of course, we're looking down Madison Avenue toward the center of the community. And I would say that probably this is the area of Skowhegan that may have changed the greatest. And I think I will leave it at that. This is from the 1920s. Now, as I mentioned in my, this is 1937, by the way. When I mentioned in my introductory remarks about Skowhegan, one of my great memories, of course, is going to all the performances at Lakewood in the 50s and the 60s. And it really was a great experience. In fact, it kind of inspired me to get involved in both junior high and high school dramatics. By the time I got to Colby, I did do one semester of dramatics, and then it was a little too intensive, and so I let that go. I gave up my dramatic career for the bureaucracy. But anyway, here we're looking at, matinee day in the summer of 1937, the great classic theater that's still very much with us. This was begun as a summer theater in 1898. And in 1901, it was taken over by Herbert L. Swett, and he remodeled the building into the present appearance in 1925-26. Again, we would characterize this as colonial revival with the grand portico porch. It's just a great landmark building, both architecturally, but also incredibly important in the history of American theater. And here's the building in the 50s, largely unchanged today. And then across the street, Swett developed, of course, the whole Lakewood resort. In the 20s, he built the Lakewood Inn. That was, again, very much in the style of the theater. And this included both the dining room and also a gift shop, which was run by his wife, Fantia Swett. And she outlived him by quite a number of years, and I got to know her quite well. She was a very lovely woman. And then on the waterfront, on Lake Wessarunset in 1929, John B. Heimer, who was a playwright, he was the amazing thing about Lakewood in those days was not only were they able to capture, and this is a little bit earlier, of course, in the teens and the 20s and the 30s, not only were they able to entice, the absolute major stars of the day, but also they had resident companies as well to back up the stars. And they even had resident playwrights like Howard Lindsay and this John Heimer. And in this case, he built the Colony House, which is this lovely sort of colonial revival shingle style house from 1929 for himself, and also to house people who were visiting, who were involved in the theater. And then up on Route 201, we have the Clubhouse, again, built in the 20s when the Lakewood was really developing as a resort, lovely shingle style building. And in the 20s and 30s, Swett developed this wonderful group of streets of little guest houses. They were almost like little miniature residential houses of the period, so that you really felt that they were homes away from home. This again is probably from about 1935 to 40, this view. The alternative, of course, if maybe you couldn't quite afford or didn't choose to stay at a little Lakewood cottage, was the Somerset Camping Grounds, which morphed later on into an even more elaborate resort of both little cottages and also a motel as well. And of course, when I came to look at Skowhegan late this spring to think about where I might do some contemporary photographs, because this is along Upper Madison Avenue as you turn to go to 201, I went looking for this. And I found Hannaford and Walmart's. So it is but a memory. And speaking of memories, let me be a little personal for a moment. This is a photograph taken in the summer of 1971 at the History House. And in that summer of 71, I had just entered Boston University Graduate School. I'm on the left. The gentleman immediately to my right is Abbott Lowell Cummings, who was one of the great scholars and experts on New England architecture, great mentor of mine. He also was head of what is now Historic New England, the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, and he and I led a tour of Maine during one of the weeks of the summer of 1971 To Abbott's right is John Seeley, who ran a drugstore in Skowhegan, and also he was the son-in-law of Blynn Page. And then to the far right is Edgar Bingham, who was the head of the Shreve, Crump, and Lowe Antiques Department in Boston. So there we are. And I made sure, loyal to Skowhegan, that Skowhegan was included on this tour of Maine. And there's the History House. Now we're going to morph into this group of photographs that were taken just a few weeks ago by David Clough, who is a wonderful architectural photographer from Rockland. And he very kindly volunteered his services to provide a few of the contemporary views. The History House, of course, is very special. Was built in wait a minute, got to get my dates right here. Built in 1839 on Elm Street, built for Abner Spear, who was a blacksmith, and opened as a museum by Louise Helen Coleman in 1937. I really appreciate Louise Helen Coleman for a number of things. First, of course, for putting together and overseeing your remarkable 2-volume history of Skowhegan, which is an invaluable compendia of local history, but also because she was a pioneer of women going to Colby in the 1870s. And after all, after her uncle, Abner Coleman, had just finished a science building for Colby, how could they not let her in? Here we're looking at the Frank W. Buckner House. Oh, I'm sorry, I got my notes mixed up here. The Henry K. White House on Maple Street and, no, forgive me. This is the Joseph Bigelow House on High Street of 1846. And this is the Joseph Bigelow whom I mentioned, who was the major architect and builder in mid-19th century Skowhegan. A wonderful sort of square Greek Revival house with a hip roof, surrounding porch, and then the pilasters with the Greek Anthemian carvings on the top of them. This was later owned by Blynn Page and his family. Now we move on to Maple Street and Madison Avenue, the Henry K. White House of 1868 in the Italianate style with the projecting cornice, the double bracketed cornices, and then the very distinctive cupola, which is typical of the Italianate style. And here, a nice example of the French Second Empire or Mansard style on Norridge Avenue, the Edwin Hill House of 1871. And now we revisit in modern photographs the Samuel W. Gould House of 1887, which is really just a treasure. And the owners have really just done a great job with it. That's one angle, and here's another. And then more recently coming back to life is the Frank W. Buckner House on Madison Avenue of 1909, now the Brick House Kitchen, designed by William Hart Taylor and Son of Boston in the English half-timbered style with the half-timbering and the stucco. And finally, out on Outer Water Street, this very elaborate colonial revival house from the turn of the century, which is based stylistically on a great house called the Lindens, the Robert Hooper House, originally built in Danvers, Massachusetts in 1754 and moved to Washington, D.C. in 1933. But architects often copied it in the colonial revival, and this is a nice attempt to copy it. We end with these buildings, which are very special. This is the Bloomfield Academy building on Main Street up in the Bloomfield area, 1840. This is the academy that was designed and built by Joseph Bigelow, and the master mason was Asa Dyer. wonderful Greek Revival building, very simple, very restrained, but with the Greek Revival pilasters across the first and second story facade, and then just a little touch of the earlier period, the Federal period, with the fan in the Greek Revival triangular pediment, gable end to the street. And next door, also the work of Joseph Bigelow, this being the First Baptist Church of 1843-44, in nice contrast, Greek Revival to the right, and then Gothic Revival in this building with the pointed arch doorways, pointed arch windows, quatrefoil in the triangular pediment, and the pinnacles or spires on the tower, but a little bit of Greek Revival mixed in the belfry there. There are Greek columns, and this is very typical of this period of the 1830s and 40s. There's a sort of eclectic mixture of both Greek and Gothic. And then we have the Park School. In the interest of transparency, so to speak, I will admit that David did have to retouch this photograph of the building, because there was never a moment when we were there on that hot day when there weren't shoppers. But through the miracle of digital photography, although it's a little scary, maybe it's the coming of artificial intelligence, David miraculously removed all the cars. But here it is, a really handsome building with the Romanesque arch doorway and the nice brickwork and the really handsome terracotta detailing. And then our final contemporary photograph is the mill of 1882, the Keane Brothers shoe factory, really quite remarkable, not only in its reuse, but also in the fact that much of its original architectural integrity is still with us today as well. It's a very handsome example of mid to late 20th century Maine and New England commercial industrial architecture. David mentioned about a little sort of fugitive offer of mine, and that is simply that I've shown you from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission collection in Augusta, just a sampling of the wonderful postcards we have. I'm sure History House has a great postcard collection, and there's hardly a town in Maine that doesn't have avid postcard collectors as well, private ones. But I felt that for the nature of the architecture that I wanted to share with you this evening, that I felt that postcards would do the best job of conveying what was built in the mid to late 19th century and what is still to a large degree with us today. That having been said, the Maine Historic Preservation Commission collection also has extensive earlier photographs of Skowhegan. We start with a group of, I think, quite rare, what we call carte visites, just very small card-like photographs that were put into albums that were done by pioneer Skowhegan photographers in the Civil War period and just afterwards in the 1860s. So we can go back photographically to Water Street and other parts of the community as early as the 1860s. And then very quickly, those CDVs are replaced by very popular stereopticon views. And in particular, Skowhegan was blessed with a number of very talented photographers who specialized in stereo views, particularly Vos and Paul and Conant. And we have large numbers of these. So I'm just taking the chance of saying that I'm probably be willing to come back again someday and share with you an earlier vision of Skowhegan architecture and the development of your wonderful community. Thank you very much.